Okay, so we're looking at lecture objective 5 here. This is to describe the effects of glucocorticoids on the body's metabolism. And then we're going to compare the physiologic effects of glucocorticoids to their pharmacological effects, right? To the drugs that can mimic this response. So let's look at the adrenal gland, right? In order to look at cortisol release and the CRH axis, we need to look at the adrenal. We've talked about the adrenal a bit before. We talked about the medulla, which is where the presynaptic neurons on the sympathetic division, some of those neurons can synapse to the chromaffin cells here. So that is more of the autonomic or nervous part of the gland. Now the cortex, the outer pale staining region of the cortex of the adrenal, is going to be where we have release of adrenocorticoids. So there's going to be 3 layers to this cortex, and then we're going to have each layer secreting the hormones we've got here. So mineralocorticoids, example of this is aldosterone, and this is going to help with sodium and potassium levels. It's going to act on the kidneys and encourage different levels of sodium and potassium absorption. So regulating our sodium and potassium balance. Then glucocorticoids, which again, this is the next layer down in the cortex. Glucocorticoids, example being cortisol. This is the body's stress hormone. So it regulates the body's stress response, and it also helps to regulate metabolism as a secondary effect. So when you think about stress, again, physical stress, which can be things like surgery, trauma, physiologic stress, which can be more emotional type stress, both of those can be regulated with the response to that is release of cortisol. And then sex hormones or androgens are secreted by the 3rd layer. This is going to help with the reproductive function, and androgens will be a precursor for the sex hormones in both males and females. So these are the 3 hormones we find being released from the cortex. Now, again, the medulla is the inner portion. This is where we have chromaffin cells, and this is where we have some of our catecholamine release. So 80% of that being epinephrine, 20% of that being norepinephrine, and then less than 1% being dopamine. Now, remember, these are released as hormones. So these go into the blood supply of the medulla. So notice how the medulla here is highly vascularized, lots of capillaries, lots of blood vessels, so that those hormones can be released and enter the blood. And we talked about how this is important for the diffuse sympathetic response, right? Having that broad general response very quickly as a part of the fight or flight response. So the adrenal medulla is going to be under neural control. We look at the preganglionic neurons that are synapsing here, and then will release secretions into the blood. So 2 totally different types of tissue in the same gland. Now, when you think about glucocorticoids specifically, this is one of the primary roles of the cortex, of the adrenals. And again, cortisol, the stress hormone, is what is released here. So this is under regulation of the CRH, ACTH axis. So that means CRH is the hypothalamic trophic hormone that is released from the hypothalamus. If you think back to the portal supply there, blood supply leaves the hypothalamus, goes down to the anterior pituitary, and then it stimulates the pituitary to release the second trophic hormone, which is ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone. From there, that enters the blood supply, and then it tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So it's really an axis in terms of the hypothalamus, pituitary, and then the adrenal cortex. Now, when cortisol hits the blood, it's going to help to mobilize energy stores. It's also going to suppress or dampen the immune response. And if you think about the exogenous cortisol, when folks are given steroids, for example, steroids are going to be the pharmacokinetic way to mimic this cortisol response. And this is where we usually give patients that have inflammatory conditions or just an overactive, hyperactive immune system. We typically give steroids to help dampen the immune response. Similar to surgery, after certain types of surgery, if there's an exaggerated immune response, we give steroids to dampen that as well. So here are some of the various types of functions that cortisol can bring about. Again, its overall role is the body's response to stress. So each of these functions will sort of align with that. It's going to have increased sympathetic activity, right? So mimicking that fight or flight response. There's going to be increased epinephrine secretion, which is in alignment with that fight or flight response. Increased ADH, so vasopressin. This is going to help with our water release and preventing the reabsorption of water in the kidneys. And then angiotensin 2, also acting on the kidneys and sodium and water reabsorption. And the overall result being fight or flight. And so in terms of energy storage, it's going to be mobilizing energy so that it can be used as a part of skeletal muscle contraction, etc., and then maintaining blood pressure to actually enact that fight or flight response, keeping blood pressure up enough for that response. So these are the various mechanisms that bring about the stress response.